What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video I'm going to be going through the second-year wide receivers and talking about whether or not I'd be buying or selling them at their current ADP. So yesterday I went through the second-year running backs. Now we're looking at the wide receiver position. These are going to be all these second-year guys that are going in the first 12 rounds of fantasy drafts. So the guys who could potentially be fantasy relevant heading into the 2024 season. And let's just dive right into it. We're going to go in order of how these guys are being drafted. So we're starting off here with the clear top guy in the second-year wide receivers. It's going to be Puka Nacua. He's currently going off the board as the wide receiver 6. He's coming off a season where he put up the third most PPR points of all time for a rookie wide receiver. He was the wide receiver 6 in points per game. He was 6th in target rate, 7th in targets, 4th in receiving yards, 5th in yak. So I agree with this wide receiver 6 ADP. This is exactly where I have him. I'm not super concerned about like a healthy Cooper Kupp. Kind of feel like that torch has been passed here. You don't put up the production that Puka did last year and then just, seriously fall off. He could pretty much replicate his production last year and he would still be a solid pick at this spot. So I think Puka, wide receiver 6, a very fair spot. I'd be buying him at that ADP. Now, the next wide receiver, we're in like the high-end wide receiver 3 territory. It's going to be Zay Flowers. He's currently being drafted as the wide receiver 25, and he had a pretty solid rookie year. Was the wide receiver 31 in points per game, which for a rookie, very solid production. 77 receptions, 858 receiving yards, 5 touchdowns. He should be the locked-in wide receiver 1 here for this Ravens offense. There's really not a ton going on behind him on the depth chart. OBJ's gone. They brought back Rashad Bateman. I've been really high on Rashad Bateman. He hasn't delivered. Could he break out? Sure, but it's not someone I'm super worried about stepping in and being like the wide receiver 1 for the Ravens here. So I think there's, reason to believe he takes a little bit of a step forward. If he was a mid-tier wide receiver 3 last year, I think drafting him as like a high-end wide receiver 3, I think it's, a fair price to pay. So Zay Flowers here at wide receiver 25. That would be a buy for me. And then right behind Zay Flowers, we have Tank Dell being drafted as the wide receiver 26. And I've already talked about Tank Dell as a must-draft wide receiver. I'm going to be way higher than consensus when it comes to Tank Dell. When we look at these 7 games in 2023 where Tank Dell and Nico Collins both played together and had over 50% of the snaps, we saw Tank Dell average 18.8 PPR points per game. Nico Collins was at 18.2. Both these guys were feasting when they were on the field together. This was not a situation where Nico Collins was way out producing Tank Dell. Tank Dell was putting up insane production when he was healthy out on the field. So I just don't understand why Dell is being drafted so firmly behind both Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs. I understand he's coming off a season-ending injury, and also he was shot this offseason, but he's healthy. He was practicing at OTAs. With how impressive he was as a rookie, like if you're going to give me Tank Dell at a wide receiver 3 price tag, I'm all in on that. You don't see someone put up the rookie numbers that he did and then all of a sudden be available at wide receiver 26. Even though there's target competition, this Texans offense should be more pass heavy. There should be more pass attempts per game, more volume to go around. So I absolutely love Tank Dell here at the wide receiver 26 spot. And then also in wide receiver 3 territory, we have Jayden Reed, and he's coming off a very impressive rookie season. Kind of came out of nowhere here. He was a day 2 pick, but I don't think people were expecting him to come in and be the fantasy wide receiver 1 here for the Packers. He was the wide receiver 26 in points per game, 912 scrimmage yards, scored 10 total touchdowns, and I think there are definitely clear reasons to be in here on Jayden Reed. He had great year 1 production. This is an ascending offense. We also saw LaFleur really look to maximize Reed's skill set. He was 8th in wide receiver carries. He was 3rd in wide receiver rushing yards. So he's not just getting work as a pass catcher. They're also using him creatively, just getting the ball in his hands. And they also went to him pretty consistently in the red zone. He was 14th in red zone targets, despite being only 40th in total targets. So once they got in the red zone, they really did hone in on Jayden Reed. So he's getting a lot of looks in the red zone, which obviously led to the touchdowns. He's getting work on the ground, which is going to help his overall production. On the other hand, though, there are some concerns here for Jayden Reed. I mentioned, the target number. He was 40th in total targets. He was 46th in targets per game. If you're 46th in targets per game, like trying to bet on you repeating like a wide receiver 26 season, I feel like the odds aren't great there. He was also 5th in touchdowns. Like, is that touchdown number sustainable? with that number of targets, like if it stays the same, is he going to be able to get into the end zone as consistently as he did last year? And then I think the other concern here is that the wide receiver depth chart just doesn't feel super settled with the Packers. You have Christian Watson, who has really flashed and had some, huge games when he has been healthy out on the field. You had Romeo Doubs with a solid season. Dontayvion Wicks was very impressive in a smaller role. So, are we so confident that Jayden Reed's going to be the locked and loaded wide receiver one? Personally, I'm not overly confident. He could definitely be the guy. He was the guy last year. Does that carry into 2024? I guess we'll wait and see. Looking at these guys at price, though, these Packers wide receivers, I would just prefer to draft Christian Watson where he's going, where I can wait, a bunch of rounds and get him later and take that shot at the wide receiver one for the Packers if he stays healthy instead of getting Jayden Reed. But I honestly think back-end wide receiver 3, he was a high-end wide receiver 3 as a rookie. I think it's a fair price to pay. So even if I do prefer Watson at cost, I'm totally fine with you drafting Jayden Reed here as a back-end wide receiver 3 option. Now let's pivot over to Jordan Addison, who's currently being drafted as the wide receiver 39. And I feel like there are some pretty clear reasons to be both in and out on Addison this season. Starting off, a little bit on the positive side. He was the wide receiver 30 in points per game, which is solid production as a rookie. Typically, if you're a mid-tier wide receiver 3, you're not going to be drafted all the way down at wide receiver 39. My concern here for 2024 is that I just don't know if his production is repeatable heading into this season. He didn't command targets at a very high level, which is somewhat concerning, right? He was 43rd in target share, 63rd in target rate, and that was with Justin Jefferson missing 7 games. So he had a prime opportunity to be the wide receiver 1 for 7 games of the season, and the targets just didn't really come. His fantasy production was really held up by scoring 10 touchdowns, which it's great he's getting into the end zone, but are we going to be expecting 10 touchdowns here in 2024? I definitely could see him improving his target earning with TJ Hawkinson likely missing a chunk of the season, so his target share could go up, his target rate could go up, but they're probably going to be less pass heavy with Kirk Cousins gone, so is that even going to make a significant difference on his overall target number? And then I think when we're looking at Addison, we have to just ask ourselves where the upside is, because he's going to be playing behind Justin Jefferson, who's going to be the clear-cut wide receiver 1 on an offense that's led by Sam Darnold or a rookie JJ McCarthy. What is the wide receiver 2 on this Vikings offense really going to get you? If last year I got you wide receiver 30, I don't know if it's going to, have much upside here. And if I'm drafting someone, I guess you're fine if they finish as a wide receiver 3, but you'd like some upside for them to be a top 24 option. So just looking at some of the players that are going in a similar range, you have rookies like Ladd McConkey, Keon Coleman. There's no guarantee those guys are going to hit as players. Jordan Addison, I think, is a better prospect than both of those guys, but they're just in such great situations where they could be the wide receiver 1 with a top quarterback from day 1. That's just not in the cards here for Jordan Addison. I also like Chris Godwin, very high on Chris Godwin, so Godwin's currently going after Addison. Would also take him here. So I guess I'm not overly high here on Jordan Addison at the wide receiver 39 spot. It just feels like you're kind of drafting him to finish exactly here as wide receiver 39, which just isn't going to give you an edge over your league mates. I'd like to see a little bit more upside, and I just don't know if Jordan Addison's going to have it this season. Now let's pivot over to Jaxon Smith-Njigba, coming off the board as the wide receiver 43. I'd say his rookie season was a little bit disappointing fantasy-wise. He was the wide receiver 56 in points per game, 63 receptions, 628 receiving yards, 4 touchdowns. Obviously, we knew heading into the season that there was going to be target competition. You had DK Metcalf, you had Tyler Lockett, but if you were drafting JSN, you're obviously betting on the talent, either, hoping he would work his way into 2 wide receiver sets, or they'd run a ton of 3 wide receiver sets. Also kind of hoping that this would just be a super high volume passing attack, a lot of yards, touchdowns to go around. None of those things really came true. The usage wasn't ideal. The Seahawks offense wasn't this amazing unit. And I do think the way JSN was kind of utilized was a little bit odd. He was a super low ADOT guy, 6.1. They were kind of trying to use him like a specialist weapon type player where you're just trying to get the ball in his hands and let him make big plays, which isn't necessarily his strength. He actually was really good after the catch in college, but he had a higher ADOT out of the slot. His ADOT was at 9, so he's not the guy where you want to give him the jet sweep or, hit him with a quick screen. It's just not really his game. But we do have a new offensive coordinator coming in, so that should shift some things up here. Obviously, he still has the target competition with DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. Lockett is getting up there in age, but still a very productive player. And then you still have Geno Smith at quarterback. So in terms of like the personnel, it's a pretty similar situation. I'm still a believer in JSN. Like that sophomore year he had was just so absurd, competing with Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, putting up numbers that were pretty much in line with those guys when they were all on the field together. So I do believe JSN's very, very talented, but I feel like once again, he's not in a great position to kind of thrive and really break out as a fantasy option. But like mid-tier wide receiver 4 territory, you're accepting that, it might be a congested wide receiver room again. Maybe he doesn't put together a monster season, but if you're just going to bet on a talented player in like the wide receiver 4 range, I think it's a very fair price. And then after Jaxon Smith-Njigba, we have Rashee Rice here, who's being drafted as the wide receiver 47. Now, obviously, his potential suspension is being factored in pretty heavily here. You could probably make the case that he'd be drafted as a top 24 wide receiver if you didn't have, any of the legal stuff going on, a potential, significant suspension heading into the year. Rice was the wide receiver 28 in points per game, and that's a solid rookie year. It's even more impressive when you look at how he closed it out. He kind of took a little bit, worked his way into the offense. The Chiefs didn't give him a huge role early on, but over the last 6 games, he averaged 18.5 PPR points per game. My problem here with Rashee Rice and why I think the suspension is a huge issue, it's not like, oh, he's going to miss 6 games or 8 games, so he's not in your lineup. Obviously, that is the concern. But if he wasn't dealing with this potential suspension, he'd be heading into the season as the locked and loaded wide receiver 1, the guy who played so well towards the end of last year. And you'd have Xavier Worthy, Hollywood Brown working their way into this offense, trying to figure out who's the wide receiver 2, who's the wide receiver 3. But Rashee Rice was likely going to be slotted in as the top dog heading into the year. But now he's giving both those guys the opportunity to have a starting spot right out of the gate and produce from day one, which is definitely not ideal. And while Rashee Rice was pretty impressive for fantasy, he was kind of used like a gadget guy. He had an ADOT under 5, which is very, very low. A lot of his touches were pretty manufactured, so he kind of played a role where you could just hand that over to another wide receiver. So I do think the suspension is bigger than just, missing a few games, because you could have Xavier Worthy step in, really break out. Maybe Hollywood Brown finally, with top quarterback play in a strong situation. Maybe they get Hollywood Brown rolling for a full season. It just opens up the opportunity for him to kind of slip down the depth chart. So back end wide receiver 4, for someone, who would be a top 24 guy without the suspension, I'm fine with his price tag. Maybe somehow the legal stuff drags on enough where he ends up getting suspended next year and not this season. I don't think that's super likely, but there is a way he pays off here. But I do think, the suspension could really hurt him here, and he could end up kind of sliding down the preferred list of weapons for Patrick Mahomes. Now, the next wide receiver, going a little bit deeper, it's going to be Dontayvion Wicks, being drafted as the wide receiver 61. Mentioned him a little bit earlier when I was talking about Jayden Reed, but he's coming off a pretty solid rookie year given his role and overall usage. 39 receptions, 581 receiving yards, 4 touchdowns, but his efficiency numbers were pretty impressive. 11th in yards per target, 24th in yards per route run, 25th in yards per reception. So at this point in drafts, right, he's being drafted as a wide receiver 6 here, like a high-end wide receiver 6. I don't think there's any harm in throwing a dart on a young player who showed some upside in year 1. There's lots of situations where guys are super efficient in a limited role, and then they get a much better opportunity, and the efficiency doesn't really translate. We do see that a decent amount, but within this Packers wide receiver room, you have Christian Watson, who I am high on, but we got to acknowledge the injury concerns. You have 3 other wide receivers then with Wicks, Reed, and Romeo Doubs. Maybe there's another injury, or maybe Wicks just balls out, takes a huge year 2 leap. So at wide receiver 61, I think it's fine. If you're a big believer in Wicks as the player, I think it makes sense to take him here. And then just going a few spots after Wicks, we have Josh Downs as the wide receiver 64. Coming off a decent rookie season, 68 receptions, 771 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. I was someone who really liked Josh Downs as a prospect. I was surprised that he slipped in the draft. Didn't love the landing spot to the Colts, so draft night kind of sucked as someone who really liked him. He also has real competition now. You have Michael Pittman there, and then also they added A.D. Mitchell in the draft. I also think on this Colts offense, like passing volume is a concern. You have JT, you have Anthony Richardson, who's obviously super mobile, can use his legs. How much overall passing volume is there going to be to share with all these wide receivers? But in general, I'm pretty high on this Colts offense. So this is another situation where like this late in drafts, I like the player. I think the offense could be decent. I think they could be a top unit. You know, you could throw a dart on Josh Downs, and I wouldn't hate it here. And then the final wide receiver who just snuck into the top 12 rounds, it's going to be Quentin Johnston, being drafted as the wide receiver 66. He had a wildly disappointing 2023, 431 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns, and this was not a situation where like he was buried on the depth chart. You had Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, who's playing as like the wide receiver 3, 4 behind Joshua Palmer. He was getting starter snaps from week 4 on. So this was just him like completely not producing. And the odds of a wide receiver like completely face planting in year 1 and then turning it around, like the odds of that are pretty low. So honestly, with Quentin Johnston here, I'm not really trying to bet on an outlier. I'm not trying to bet on him, you know, having some sort of insane turnaround in year 2. Even though the situation is so perfect, like to fall on your face that hard, it's going to be tough for me to buy in again. So I would much rather just re-roll on a different young wide receiver. So instead of taking Quentin Johnston in this area, you have guys like Xavier Legette, Ricky Pearsall, Jalen Polk. Like those are all guys I'd be interested in, and those aren't even guys I'm super high on like dynasty wise, but Legette could have an opportunity to be a starter from day 1. Pearsall not going to be a starter unless there's a trade, but injuries could open something up on a great offense. Jalen Polk could be the wide receiver 1, you know, for the Patriots here. So I would just rather take a swing on those guys. They're unproven. They might not work out, but we've seen it with Quentin Johnston. It didn't look great, so I'd rather just go in a different direction. But that's going to wrap it up for these second-year wide receivers. Overall, some interesting options. You know, we had the top dog with Puka, and then I think a lot of interesting players going in like that wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 range, kind of battling talent versus situation. You know, some things we have to consider here. But if you enjoyed the video, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. Thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.